Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. In the summer of 2020, I found myself stationed at Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska, the largest national park in the United States. My name is Joe, and I've been a park ranger for most of my adult life. I grew up in a small town in Montana, where the wilderness was my playground and teacher. The solitude of the mountains always appealed to me more than the hustle and bustle of city life. My colleagues often joked that I preferred the company of trees to people, and they weren't entirely wrong. One crisp morning in early September, I was assigned to check on a remote outpost near the Canadian border. The area was known for its rugged terrain and was seldom visited by tourists. My supervisor wanted me to assess the condition of the trails and report any signs of illegal hunting or trapping. It was a routine task, one I'd done countless times before. I set out at dawn, the sun casting a golden hue over the snow-capped peaks. The air was thin but invigorating, filling my lungs with each deep breath. As I navigated the winding paths, I couldn't help but admire the untouched beauty around me. The trees stood tall like silent guardians, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. About 4 hours into my hike, I noticed something unusual. The forest grew eerily quiet. The familiar sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves had ceased. It was as if the wilderness was holding its breath. I brushed it off, attributing the silence to my overactive imagination. Continuing along the trail, I stumbled upon a campsite. At first glance, it seemed abandoned. The tent was pitched haphazardly, and equipment was strewn about carelessly. Approaching cautiously, I called out, "Hello, this is Ranger Joe. Is anyone here?" There was no response. Examining the site, I found a backpack containing a wallet. The ID belonged to a man named Mark from Anchorage. He didn't have any permits for camping in this area, which was concerning. More alarming was the state of the campsite itself. Food containers were open, and a fire pit was left smoldering, both violations of park regulations. I radioed back to the station. "Dispatch, this is Joe. I've found an unauthorized campsite belonging to a Mark. No sign of the individual." "Copy that, Joe," came the reply. "Proceed with caution and keep us updated. Over." I decided to search the immediate area for any signs of Mark. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed claw marks etched into the bark of several trees. They were high up, about 8 feet from the ground, and spaced regularly. Bears were common in these parts, but these marks didn't match any I'd seen before. Further ahead, I found scraps of torn clothing snagged on a bush flannel fabric, stained with what looked like dried blood. My stomach tightened. I had a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Dispatch, I've got possible signs of a struggle. Blood on clothing fragments. Requesting backup and a search team." "Understood, Joe. Backup is en route. Estimated arrival in 3 hours. Stay safe." Over. 3 hours felt like an eternity under the circumstances. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran through me despite the midday sun. I pressed on, following a faint trail of disturbed foliage. The ground was uneven, and footprints were obscured by the dense undergrowth. Suddenly I heard a faint sound, a low, guttural noise that I couldn't quite place. It was unlike any animal call I was familiar with. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Moving quietly, I approached the source of the sound. I came upon a clearing, and what I saw made my blood run cold. In the center lay the remains of what could only be Mark. His body was mangled beyond recognition, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Deep gashes crisscrossed his torso, and his face was contorted in a grimace of sheer terror. Surrounding him were remnants of other animals, rabbits, deer, even a moose, all mutilated in a similar fashion. I struggled to keep my composure as I radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Joe. I've located Mark. He's deceased. The scene it's bad. Possible animal attack, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen. Over. Joe, backup is still 2 hours out. Do you need to evac?" I considered my options. Protocol dictated that I should wait for backup, but something compelled me to stay. Perhaps it was a sense of duty or a desire to find answers. "I'm going to secure the area and see if I can find any clues about what happened. Proceed with extreme caution. Keep the line open. Over." As I surveyed the gruesome scene, I noticed footprints leading away from the clearing. They were large and oddly shaped, resembling those of a wolf, but much larger and with elongated toes. I took photographs with my phone, documenting everything for the investigation. Following the tracks, I descended into a ravine where the vegetation grew thicker. The canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight, casting the area in shadows. The air was heavy, and each step seemed to echo unnaturally. Out of nowhere, a figure darted between the trees ahead. It was quick, almost a blur, but I caught a glimpse. The creature moved on all fours but had the musculature of something that could stand upright. Its fur was matted and dark, blending seamlessly with the surroundings. My heart pounded as I realized I might be tracking the very thing that killed Mark. I gripped the handle of my utility knife, the only weapon I had on me, silently cursing myself for not bringing a firearm. I heard the sound again, a low, menacing growl that sent a shiver down my spine. The creature emerged from behind a tree about 20 yards away, and this time I saw it clearly. It resembled a wolverine, but was at least the size of a grizzly bear. Its eyes were small and black, its snout elongated with sharp yellow teeth protruding, even when its mouth was closed. Muscles rippled beneath its coarse fur, and its claws were long and curved, designed for ripping flesh. For a moment, we locked eyes. There was an intelligence there, a calculated awareness that this was not a mere animal acting on instinct. I took a cautious step back, maintaining eye contact, hoping not to provoke it. Without warning, it charged. I turned and ran, adrenaline fueling my sprint back up the ravine. The creature was fast, faster than anything that size should be. I could hear it gaining on me, the sound of its massive paws pounding the earth. Desperate, I veered off the path and scrambled up a rocky incline, hoping the uneven terrain would slow it down. Reaching the top, I spotted an old cabin, a relic from the gold rush era, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. I dashed toward it, throwing myself against the rickety door. It gave way, and I stumbled inside. The interior was dim, filled with decaying furniture and the smell of damp wood. I searched frantically for anything I could use as a weapon, finding an old rifle mounted above the fireplace. I grabbed it and checked the chamber. Luck was on my side. There was a single bullet left. I positioned myself near a window, trying to steady my shaking hands. The creature circled the cabin, its heavy footsteps audible over the creaking of the old structure. I caught glimpses of it moving past the gaps in the wooden walls. It was toying with me. Suddenly, the window shattered as the creature's massive claws ripped through. I fired instinctively. The bullet struck its shoulder, and it let out a sound that was a mix of a roar and a scream. It retreated momentarily, giving me a sliver of hope. Knowing the rifle was now useless, I barricaded the door with a broken table and searched for an escape route. The cabin had a cellar door, likely leading to an old root cellar. I pried it open and descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty. Feeling along the walls, I found a tunnel at the back, perhaps an old escape route miners used. With no other options, I ventured into the narrow passage, forcing me to crouch. Behind me, I heard the creature tearing through the cabin above. It wouldn't be long before it discovered the cellar. I moved as quickly as the confined space allowed, the tunnel winding deeper into the earth. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light ahead. The tunnel opened up to the side of a hill overlooking a river. I emerged, gasping for fresh air, but my relief was short-lived. The creature stood across the river, its eyes fixed on me. Blood oozed from the wound in its shoulder, staining its dark fur. It began to wade into the water, unbothered by the swift current. I scanned the area for anything to defend myself. On the ground nearby was a rusted bear trap, likely left by poachers. I set it up at the riverbank, hiding it under a layer of leaves and debris. Backing away, I picked up a hefty branch and waited. The creature emerged from the river, water cascading off its massive frame. It moved toward me, each step deliberate. As it closed the distance, its front paw landed squarely on the concealed trap. The metal jaws snapped shut with a resounding clank, piercing its flesh. The creature let out a deafening howl, thrashing violently in an attempt to free itself. Seizing the opportunity, I struck its injured shoulder with the branch. The makeshift weapon broke on impact, but the force drove the creature back toward the river. It stumbled, the weight of the trap unbalancing it. With one final push, I shoved it into the water. The current was strong, and the added weight of the trap pulled the creature downstream. I watched as it disappeared around a bend, the sounds of its struggle fading into the distance. Exhausted, I collapsed on the riverbank. My radio crackled to life. "Joe, this is dispatch. Backup is arriving at your last known location. What's your status?" "Over." I mustered the strength to respond. "This is Joe. I'm about half a mile east of the outpost, near the river. Encountered an aggressive animal. Mark is confirmed dead. Over." "Understood. Medics are on the way. Hang tight. Over." Within 30 minutes, a team of rangers and medics arrived. They tended to my minor injuries and escorted me back to the main station. I provided a detailed report of the events, though I could tell some of my colleagues were skeptical about the creature I described. A search team was dispatched to retrieve Mark's body and to look for any signs of the animal. They found the campsite and the gruesome scene but reported no traces of the creature. The bear trap was recovered downstream, mangled as if torn apart by immense force. Over the following days, park authorities launched an investigation. Wildlife experts were brought in to analyze the claw marks and footprints. The consensus was inconclusive. They couldn't match them to any known species in the region. Rumors began to circulate among the rangers. Some thought it was a rogue grizzly or a wolf hybrid. Others whispered about cryptids and creatures from indigenous folklore. The official report cited a rare bear attack, urging caution in remote areas of the park. As for me, I returned to my duties, patrolling the vast wilderness of Wrangell St. Elias. The memory of that day remained vivid, a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability. Weeks later, while reviewing trail camera footage from various locations, I came across something unsettling. In one of the clips, dated 2 days after the incident, a shadowy figure moved swiftly past the camera. It was brief but unmistakable, the same creature I had encountered. I brought it to the attention of the authorities, but technical issues had corrupted the file, rendering it unusable as evidence. Without concrete proof, there was little that could be. Life in the park continued as usual. Tourists came and went, unaware of the lurking danger that possibly roamed the depths of the wilderness. Warnings were issued about staying on designated trails and reporting any unusual sight. One evening, as I was closing up the station, a local hunter named Abe approached me. He was an older man, rugged and seasoned by years in the Alaskan wilds. "You're Joe, right?" "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I heard about your run-in up near the border. Thought you should know you're not the first to see that beast." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you've seen—" "Not personally, but stories have been around for generations. They call it the Amak, a giant wolf that hunts. It's said to be a guardian of the land, striking down those who disrespect." "I'm not one for legends," I replied, though his words intrigued. "Legend or not, be careful out there," he said before walking away. I pondered his warning but remained grounded in reality. Whether the creature was an undiscovered species or something beyond explanation, one thing was certain. It was dangerous. The following morning, a new assignment came in. Hikers had reported strange noises near Mount Drum. As the most experienced ranger available, I was tasked with investigating. Packing my gear, I prepared to venture once more into the unknown, ever vigilant of the mysteries the wilderness might unveil. Man, I still remember that day like it was yesterday. 1993, out in Badlands National Park, South Dakota. I was working as a ranger back then. Name's Mark Johnson. And let me tell you, I wasn't exactly born for the great outdoors. Grew up in Chicago, where the closest thing to a tree was the sad-looking potted plant outside our apartment building. Funny how life turns out, huh? Ended up wearing a ranger uniform miles away from all the city noise. But I liked it, though. The quiet, the isolation, it suited me just fine. That day started like any other. Routine patrol, checking the backcountry campsites, making sure no one was setting fires where they shouldn't. The usual stuff. I didn't mind being alone out there. People talked about getting lonely, but that wasn't me. You get used to it. In fact, I kinda preferred it. The only weird thing about that morning was the fog. It rolled in thick, unusually thick, and just sort of hung there. I'd seen fog before, sure, but nothing like this. Badlands wasn't exactly known for it, but hey, weather's weird sometimes, right? I didn't think much of it at first. Then, around noon, I got a call about a couple of hikers who hadn't returned to their campsite. Typical city folk, probably got lost or distracted by some rock formation. I grabbed my gear and headed out to find them. Wasn't really worried. The trail they were on wasn't particularly difficult, just long and winding. Easy enough to get turned around in if you weren't paying attention. I was a couple of miles in when I first noticed something strange. The fog hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed to be getting thicker. I paused, listened, nothing. Dead quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of traffic that sometimes carried from the park's outer edges. Just silence. For the first time that day, I felt off. It was like the air had gotten heavier, you know? My instincts were kicking in, telling me something wasn't right. But I pressed on, figuring the hikers were probably out there somewhere, shivering in the mist, waiting for a rescue. The trail led to a ravine, and as I approached, I noticed the fog seemed to cling more tightly to that area, swirling in these slow, unnatural patterns. I couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. I called out, but my voice was muffled by the thick air. No response. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the ravine, something large was lying in the brush. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a bison that had taken a bad fall. But as I got closer, I realized it was too twisted, too unnatural in shape. My stomach dropped when I saw what it really was. One of the hikers, or at least what was left of him. The body had been torn apart, limbs scattered like someone had tried to pull him in different directions. His chest was gone, just a gaping cavity where his organs used to be. I'd seen plenty of dead animals in my time, but nothing like this. This wasn't the work of an animal, no way. I barely had time to process it before I heard something, a low rustling in the brush not far from the body. My hand instinctively went to my radio, but I hesitated. If I called it in, what was I going to say? That I found a body ripped apart in the middle of nowhere with no sign of what did it. They'd think I was crazy. The rustling got louder. Something was moving fast. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse through the fog. A shape, hulking, low to the ground, moving with a speed that didn't make sense for something so big. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. Hell, it wasn't even close to anything you'd expect in the Badlands. My mind went blank, trying to match it to anything I knew, but there was nothing. I didn't wait to get a closer look. I bolted, stumbling up the ravine, legs barely functioning as my mind screamed at me to move faster. I don't know what possessed me to run, but every instinct I had was screaming that if I didn't, I'd be joining that poor hiker at the bottom of the ravine. As I ran, the fog seemed to close in tighter, like it was alive, like it was trying to swallow me whole. My radio crackled to life, something about another ranger calling in, but the signal was garbled, broken by the interference. I didn't have time to respond. I reached the trailhead, lungs burning, legs shaking, but the fog didn't clear. It just hung there, thick and oppressive, and I realized with a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me. I heard the rustling again, this time closer, Too close. I spun around, hand shaking, trying to steady my breathing. It was massive, crouched low to the ground like a predator. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been living underground for God knows how long. It moved in a way that reminded me of a reptile, but its limbs were too long, too twisted. And the smell hit me all at once. Rotting decay, like something that had been festering for years. I stumbled back, reaching for my knife. Useless, but it was all I had. The thing let out a noise, something guttural and deep, vibrating in the air around me. It wasn't a growl, but it was close enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. I had nowhere to go. The trail was blocked by the thing, and the only other option was the ravine. I couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped. I tumbled down the side of the ravine, slamming into rocks, branches, anything that broke my fall. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't care. I hit the bottom hard, gasping for air, my vision swimming from the impact. The thing was still up there, prowling, searching. I could hear it sniffing the air, tracking me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. But I kept still, praying it wouldn't find me. Minutes passed, agonizingly slow, each one dragging longer than the last. Finally, the rustling faded. The fog seemed to loosen its grip, and I dared to breathe again. I forced myself to move, crawling through the underbrush, trying to put as much distance between me and that creature as possible. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Eventually I reached a service road, bruised, bleeding, but alive. I radioed in the attack, left out the details about what exactly I saw though. Who would believe? When backup arrived, they found the body of the hiker, but no trace of the thing. I knew it was still out there though. Hell, I still do. They filed it away as a wild animal attack. That's the official story anyway. Me? I never went back to that section of the park. They could call me paranoid, but I wasn't going to test my luck twice. And here's the kicker. 2 days later, I heard another hiker went missing near the same spot. No body, no trace. Just gone. I still can't understand why people get all dreamy-eyed about being alone in the middle of nowhere. It sounds great until you're the only one who knows how to stop a bleeding wound or outrun a mountain lion. People call me lucky, but luck has an expiration date. The year was 2010, and I was stationed at the Shawnee-Nashma Forest in Wyoming. Just another day in a long line of days. My name's Jake, by the way, Jake Malone. Grew up in Michigan, but I'd been out west long enough to say y'all, without sounding like a complete phony. My dad ran a lumber mill back home, the kind of place where you didn't clock out with clean fingernails. I always thought that rough and tumble life was for me, but the older I got, the less I liked being stuck in one spot. Dirty work, sure, but it came with the thrill of always being on the move. That day we got a report about a missing family, tourists, the kind who show up with brand new hiking boots and think their phone will get them anywhere. Idiots, right? So, naturally, when people like that go missing, they send out people like me. Here's the kicker. I wasn't alone on this one. I had Mark Ellis with me, another ranger who swore he'd ditch the forest one day and open a bakery. Yeah, a bakery. Mark, with his linebacker build and a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of granite, wanted to make cupcakes. It was one of our running jokes. Bread with a side of bruising, we'd say. Mark and I hit the trail by noon. We were deep in the northern section, a part of the forest that always gave me the creeps. Mark joked about setting up his cupcake kingdom somewhere nearby. Great spot for dark chocolate croissants and dismemberment, he said. Always had a way of finding humor in the darkest places. That's how we coped out there, cracking jokes, making light of serious stuff. By the time we found the family's campsite, my gut was screaming that something was off. Their tent was still up, backpacks scattered around, but no sign of them. Not a footprint, not even a half-eaten sandwich on the picnic table. Ever had that feeling of knowing you're not alone when you should be? It was like that, but cranked up to 11. Mark started yelling out names, but the silence just swallowed his voice whole. I kept walking towards the edge of the camp when something caught my eye. An animal carcass, a deer, or what was left of one, mangled beyond recognition. I'd seen what bears could do to a carcass, but this wasn't just torn apart. It was like something had taken pleasure in shredding it to pieces, like someone had grabbed a pair of claws and just played with it. Guess something around here doesn't have a bakery on its mind, Mark said flatly. Yeah, no kidding, I muttered, scanning the area. Mark froze, his usual sarcasm gone. I followed his gaze to a tree about 10 feet away. Claw marks. No bear I'd ever seen could make scratches like that, parallel lines, like something had dragged its nails through the bark like it was nothing. 5 marks, too wide for a cougar, too deliberate for anything I knew. Mark tried to lighten the mood. Must be one of your Michigan bears. Guess they learned to walk on 2 legs now. I chuckled, but it felt forced. He was right about one thing, though. The marks were high, way higher than any animal in these parts should be able to reach. Then there was the stench, not the kind that comes with a fresh kill. This was old, festering, like something had died days ago, but it was everywhere, like the air itself had soaked it up. We circled back to the tent, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I heard it. Movement. Something heavy breaking branches. Not fast. I glanced at Mark. His hand instinctively went to his rifle, but we couldn't see a damn thing. Whatever it was just out of sight, hanging at the edge of the tree. Mark's usual bravado slipped away. What do you think, Jake? Cougar doesn't leave claw marks like that, I replied. Suddenly, there was a low thud, followed by a long, dragging sound. We exchanged a look. In that split second, we both knew we weren't dealing with a cougar, a bear, or any wild animal we'd come across before. Something was out there, something that had no business being in those woods, and it was close. Mark started towards the sound. Stay behind me, he said, and for once, I didn't argue. His steps were slow, careful. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, but I forced myself to move with. We rounded a boulder, and that's when we saw it. Well, but it wasn't the fur that made me freeze. It was the hands. Long, clawed fingers that looked almost human. Almost, but wrong. Too long, too skeletal. It moved like it was dragging something. Mark didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The crack echoed through the trees, and the thing recoiled. Screech. I swear my ears were bleeding. It didn't drop, though. It lunged at us, fast and unnatural, like its bones were made of rubber. Mark got off another shot, but I don't think it meant. It barreled into him, claws slashing. I barely had time to react before it was on him, raking through his jacket, ripping skin and muscle. I can still hear him. I fired at its back, again and again. Blood sprayed, dark and thick, but it was like shooting through water. It turned to me, and its eyes, God, those empty. I wasn't supposed to look, but there they were, like nothing I'd ever seen. Then it bolted, dragging Mark with it. He was screaming, but it was muffled, desperate. I chased it, but it was gone before I even realized. There was blood, Mark's blood, on the ground. I couldn't follow it. Not on foot, not in that terrain, not with the sun dropping and no back. I hated myself for stopping, but I wasn't suicidal. I don't care how much adrenaline was pumping through me. I wasn't stupid. When I got back to the station, I was a mess, rambling about claw marks and mangled bodies. They sent out a search party the next morning. Took them 2 days to find Mark. What was left of him anyway? The official report said it was a grisly attack. I know better, but nobody's asking me for the I left a week later, packed my things, moved south. Now I've got an office job where the only things that come at me are emails and obnoxious coworkers. But sometimes, when I sit there staring at the computer screen, I think about what really happened out there. Mark wanted to bake cupcakes. Now he's a pile of bones in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, luck runs out. The year was 2012, and I found myself stationed at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. My name is Jake Riley, and I'd been a park ranger for about 7 years at that point. I'd always loved the outdoors, probably inherited that from my dad, who was an avid hiker and dragged me along on his adventures whenever he could. Working at Crater Lake felt like a dream come true. The deep blue water surrounded by cliffs and the dense forest were a daily reminder of nature's grandeur. One crisp morning, I was assigned to check on some of the more remote trails that hadn't been visited in a while. The park had received reports of fallen trees blocking paths and some minor landslides due to recent rains. I geared up, making sure I had my radio, map, and a thermos of coffee. Couldn't start my day without. I set out in my Jeep, driving as far as the road allowed before I'd have to proceed on. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something odd. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wildlife was just having an off. I continued along the trail, noting the locations of fallen branches and eroded sections that would need attention. As I ventured deeper, I came across a section of the trail that was completely obliterated. Trees were uprooted, and the earth looked like it had been churned up by some massive force. Looks like a tornado passed through, I muttered to myself, but there hadn't been any reports of extreme weather. Puzzled, I took out my camera and started documenting the damage. While snapping photos, I caught a whiff of something foul, a mix of wet dog and rotten meat. It was potent enough to make me gag. I said aloud, covering my nose with my sleeve. I decided to investigate, thinking perhaps an animal had died nearby. As a ranger, it was part of my job to report these things. I followed the smell off the trail and into the thick brush. The further I went, the stronger it became. Then I saw it, a deer carcass. or what was left. The body was torn apart, limbs scattered, and the rib cage cracked open. This wasn't the work of a bear or wolves. It was too brutal, too chaotic. Predators in these parts are messy, but not to this extent. Well, that's unsettling, I mumbled. I took a few steps back, deciding it was best to return and file a report. As I turned around, I heard a faint rustling behind. I spun back but saw nothing. Probably just the wind, I thought, trying to shake off the creeping unease. I retraced my steps to the trail, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following. The silence of the forest was now suffocating. I picked up my pace. About 20 minutes later, I reached a small clearing where we had a supply shed for trail maintenance equipment. I decided to stop there, grab a drink, and collect my thoughts. As I approached the shed, I noticed the door was ajar. "That's odd," I said. "We always kept these locked." I pushed the door open cautiously. Inside, the place was a mess. Tools were strewn about, and bags of fertilizer had been ripped open. Did vandals make it out this far? I radioed back to the station. "This is Riley, reporting in from Sector 5. The supply shed here has been vandalized. Over." Silence. "Control, do you read me?" Over. Still no. I checked. The radio battery was full. Signal strong. Must be interference. Just then, I heard a low rumbling noise from outside. Not a growl exactly, but more like a deep exhale from something large. I quietly set the radio down and reached for the flare gun we kept in the shed for emergencies. Clutching it tightly, I stepped outside to look around. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I spotted movement. Something massive was partially hidden behind the trees. It was difficult to make out, but it seemed to be covered in matted fur. Its body as big as a moose, but with a hunched posture more akin to a gorilla. "What in the world?" I whispered. The creature stepped forward slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. It resembled a boar snout, combined with the sharp features of a wolf. Its eyes were small but fixated on me. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was no animal I'd ever seen or heard. My mind raced with possibilities. A mutated bear, an undiscovered species. Whatever it was, it didn't look friendly. The creature began to circle the clearing, never taking its eyes off me. I raised the flare gun, not sure if it would deter the beast, but hoping it might scare it off. "Stay," I shouted, my voice betraying more confidence than I felt. It responded by baring a set of teeth that looked like a cross between a predator's canines and tusks. Then, with alarming speed, I fired the flare gun directly at it. The flare struck its shoulder, igniting the creature let out a horrific sound, a mix of a squeal and a roar, and veered off course, slamming into the side of the shed. I didn't wait to see what happened. I bolted back toward the trail, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I could hear the beast thrashing and the sound of wood splintering. It was disoriented but not As I ran, I grabbed my radio again. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Riley. I'm being pursued by something. I need immediate assistance. Over. Static." I cursed, shoving the radio back onto my bed. The path ahead forked, and without thinking I veered left, heading toward a section of the park known for its rocky terrain and caves. My hope was to find a place to hide, or at least terrain that would slow the creature down. The forest around me blurred as I ran. Branches slapped against my face and arms, but I ignored the sting. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The creature was gaining on. Then, up ahead, I saw a figure on the trail, a hiker. "Hey, get out of here," I shouted. The hiker turned, a young man probably in his 20s with earbuds in his ear. He didn't seem to grasp the urgency of the situation. I reached him and grabbed his arm. "We have to go." "What? Who? What's going on?" he asked, pulling out an earbud. No time to explain. I dragged him along, but it was too late. The creature burst onto the trail behind us. The hiker's eyes widened in terror. "Just run!" I yelled. We sprinted together, but the hiker was slower, panic overtaking his coordination. The creature closed the distance with horrifying speed. I glanced back just in time to see it swipe at the hiker, its massive clawed hands slashing across his back. He screamed and fell to the ground. I skidded to a halt. Every instinct told me to keep running, but I couldn't just leave him. I looked around frantically and spotted a large branch on the ground. I grabbed it and swung it at the creature as it loomed over "Over here," I shouted, striking its side. The creature turned its attention to me, snarling. Up close, the smell was overpowering, a nauseating mix of decay and wet. It swung at me, and I barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as its claws missed my face by inches. The hiker tried to crawl away, but the creature noticed and knocked him back down with a brutal. The branch in my hands was my only weapon. I swung again, this time hitting its head. The branch snapped in half. The creature seemed more annoyed than hurt. It fixed its gaze on me, and in that moment, I knew I had to lead it away from the injured hiker. I threw the remaining piece of the branch at its face and took off down the trail. "Come on, you ugly brute," I shouted over my shoulder. It took the bait, charging after me with renewed fury. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they might give out, but I pushed. The terrain became more rugged as I approached the rocky area. If I could just make it to the caves, maybe I could lose. I reached the entrance of one of the larger caves and dashed inside. Darkness enveloped me, but I didn't dare stop. I fumbled for the flashlight on my belt, flicked it on, and plunged deeper into the cave. Behind me, the creature's heavy footsteps echoed ominously. The passageway narrowed, and I squeezed through a tight gap between the rocks. The creature, larger than me, might not be able to follow, I hoped. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a horrific scraping sound as the creature tried to force its way through the gap. The rocks trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. I backed away slowly. Just then I noticed something on the cave floor, a pile of bones, human bones, skulls, rib cages, scattered remnants of what once were people. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing had been hunting humans. A surge of fear propelled me deeper into the cave. I needed to find another exit. The narrow passage opened up into a larger chamber. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and the air was damp and cold. My flashlight flickered. A bad time for the battery to die. I muttered, tapping it. On the far side, there appeared to be a faint glimmer of light, perhaps another way out. I moved quickly, carefully stepping over rocks and trying not to make noise. Behind me, the scraping intensified, followed by a loud crash. The creature had forced its way through. Its silhouette filled the passageway, eyes glinting with predatory intent. I broke into a run, heading toward the light. The creature let out a bone-chilling sound and pursued. The chamber led to a sloping tunnel that angled upward. I could feel fresh air. An exit was close. I scrambled up the incline, slipping on loose gravel. The creature was right behind me. I could feel the heat of its breath as I reached the top. I burst out of the cave and onto a ledge overlooking a deep ravine. Great, I thought. No way forward, and the beast closing in. I glanced around desperately. It was risky, but it was my only option. I edged onto the path, pressing myself against the rock wall. The creature emerged from the cave entrance, pausing as it saw me on the ledge. It seemed hesitant, perhaps aware of the danger of the narrow path. I inched along, not daring to look down. The creature paced at the cave entrance, snarling but not advancing. "Maybe you can't get me out here," I said under my breath. Just then, the beast made a decision. It leaped onto the path, its weight causing rocks to crumble and fall into the ravine. The path was too narrow for both of us. I had to act fast. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pocket knife. Not much, but better than nothing. As the creature advanced, I waited until it was close enough, then lunged forward, stabbing at its face. The blade grazed its skin, barely making an impact, but the sudden move startled the creature. It recoiled, losing its footing on the unstable path. For a moment it teetered on the edge, claws scrambling for seizing the opportunity. I kicked at its midsection with all my strength. The creature let out a furious sound as it slipped over the edge, plummeting into the ravine. I pressed myself against the wall, breathing hard. I waited, listening for any sign that it had survived the fall. Silence, except for the distant sound of crashing rocks. It was carefully. I made my way back along the path and down the slope, retracing my steps to the trail. My mind was racing with thoughts of the hiker. I had to find him and get help. As I reached the spot where the attack had occurred, I found him lying on the ground motionless. Blood pooled around his body. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. He was gone. I felt a mix of sorrow and anger. This shouldn't have happened. I radioed again, and this time I got a response. "Control here, Riley. We've been trying to reach you. What's your status?" "Oh, this is Riley. I need immediate assistance. At Sector 7, there's a fatality, male hiker, early 20s, possible animal attack." "Oh, understood. Sending emergency services now." "Are you injured?" "Oh, I'm okay," I replied, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. I sat down near the hiker's body, waiting for help to arrive. My thoughts were a jumble of disbelief and grim acceptance. Whatever that creature was, it was unlike anything documented. When the emergency team arrived, I briefed them on what had happened, leaving out no details. They looked skeptical but didn't question me. The body was taken away, and an investigation was launched. In the following days, search teams scoured the area. They found the cave with the human remains, confirming my account. The ravine was searched, but no trace of the creature was found. Some speculated it had been a bear with a rare deformity, or perhaps a misidentified known species. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't something that fit into any category. The park was temporarily closed to the public, and warnings were issued about possible dangerous wildlife. Life at the park changed after that. Extra precautions were taken, and we were all on high alert. The death of the hiker weighed heavily on everyone. As for me, I continued my duties, the forest held secrets, some that perhaps were better left undiscovered. I don't like to complain, but things were already going downhill that morning before the chaos even started. It was 1996 in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, and I was dealing with the usual ranger work, tracking lost hikers, dealing with tourists who thought leave no trace was just a suggestion. My name's Owen Reed, and I've been doing this job for about 11 years now, never expecting the kind of horror that unfolded that day. You'd think 11 years out in the wild would harden you to most things, right? Wrong. No amount of time can prepare you for seeing the kind of stuff that makes you second guess whether you're awake or stuck in some twisted night. I wasn't prepared to deal with whatever the hell it was that showed up that day. But who would? My day had started with a simple call. 2 hikers, both in their 20s, had gone missing. They'd ventured off trail somewhere near Hazel Mountain Overlook, where the woods get thicker than a politician's promise. I was the unlucky one sent to track them down, and my gut was already telling me it was going to be one of those days where something would go very wrong. The sky was overcast, a heavy blanket of gray, but at least it wasn't raining. The air smelled damp, like the ground was holding on to last night's moisture. I slung my pack over my shoulder, double-checked my radio, and headed into the woods, figuring I'd find these kids sitting on a log, clueless, maybe trying to convince each other that they weren't lost. But what I found wasn't clueless hikers. 2 hours in, I picked up a trail. Broken branches, scuffed dirt, typical signs of panic. The kind of trail that says, "We went from a fun hike to holy crap, get me out of here." I followed it until I found their backpacks, discarded by a tree, and that's when my stomach dropped. It's never a good sign when hikers ditch their gear. It usually means one thing. They were running. As I kept following their path, I started noticing something strange. The forest had gone dead quiet, like someone had hit a mute button. No birds, no rustling leaves. That kind of silence isn't normal out here. It's the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched, or worse, hunted. I don't like jumping to conclusions, but that's when I saw the first real sign that something was wrong. A smear of blood on a tree trunk. Not a lot, but enough to tell me one of those kids was hurt. My stomach knotted up, and I radioed in to let the station know I'd found a possible blood trail. They told me to proceed with caution, like that wasn't already obvious. Caution was the only thing keeping me from bolting back to my... Another 50 yards ahead, I found one of them, or what was left of them. The body was mangled, and it was hard to tell where the person ended and the ground began. This wasn't some animal attack. I've seen bear maulings, cougar attacks, even people stupid enough to get on the wrong side of a wild boar. This was different. Whatever had gotten to this kid was methodical, almost precise, like it wanted to take its time. I don't know what held me together in that moment. Maybe it was the dark humor that comes with the job. You either laugh at the absurdity of life or it swallows you whole. I muttered to myself, well, it looks like somebody had a bad day, which I admit was probably the most inappropriate thing I've ever said given the situation. But if you don't make jokes, you'll start crying, and I wasn't about to let that happen. I didn't have long to contemplate the horror in front of me, though, because I heard something. Footsteps, not mine. Slow, deliberate, Too heavy for a deer, too light for a bear. I crouched behind a tree and waited, heart pounding so hard I thought it'd give me away. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard it, a sound that chilled me to my core, like a low rumbling breath. Not quite human, but not entirely animal. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, waiting for the thing to move. Eventually the footsteps resumed, fading into the distance, and I knew I wasn't alone out, that whatever had torn that hiker apart was still close. My hand shook as I radioed back to the station, but the static on the line told me everything I needed to know. I was cut off. I knew I had two choices, though. Head back the way I came or try to find the second hiker. The rational part of me screamed to get out, but I couldn't just leave, not knowing if the other kid was still alive out. So I did the dumb thing. I followed the blood. It took another hour, creeping through the woods, every sound putting me on edge. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around so fast I almost tripped over my own. But nothing was there, just my paranoia getting the better of me. Or so I thought. When I finally found the second hiker, she was alive. Barely. She was huddled in the hollow of a fallen tree, shaking, covered in dirt and blood. Her eyes darted around like she expected something to leap out at any second. I knelt next to her and asked her what happened, but she couldn't. She just kept muttering the same thing over and over, like a broken record. It saw us. It saw. I tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. I needed to get her out of there fast. That's when I heard it again. Those heavy, deliberate footsteps. Closer this time. Too close. I yanked her out of the hollow, practically dragging her as we stumbled through the underbrush. My heart was in my throat, and every instinct screamed that we were being hunted. I didn't have a gun. Park rangers aren't usually armed, and even if I had one, I wasn't sure it would have done any good against whatever was stalking. We didn't stop running until we hit the trail, but even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see it bursting through the tree. The girl kept mumbling under her breath, something about long teeth and sharp claws, but I didn't have time to make sense. By some miracle, we made it back to the overlook where my truck was parked. I threw her into the passenger seat and gunned the engine, speeding down the dirt road like a bat out of hell. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my brain was working overtime trying to process what just happened. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what I saw. Something out there had killed that hiker, and if we'd stayed a minute longer, it would have gotten us. The girl didn't say much on the ride back. She just stared out the window, eyes wide, like she was waiting for something to leap out of the tree. When we finally reached the station, I handed her off to the medics and filed my report. Of course, I left out the part about the thing I'd heard in the woods. Who'd believe me? And days later, I learned they found more bodies. Not just the hikers, but some missing campers too. Torn apart, limbs scattered, like someone had tossed them aside in a fit of... The locals started whispering about the old legends again. The ones about creatures that lived in the mountains long before people ever set foot. I don't know what was out there that day, and honestly I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back to Hazel Mountain. Some things are better left alone, and whatever that thing was, it's still out. Maybe it's waiting for another poor soul to wander too far off the trail, or maybe it's already found its next victim. But that's someone else's problem. I live on the NSW Central Coast, right near Brisbane Water National Park. I mean, some houses are practically in the park. Their back fences are that close. My partner and I are always out in the bush, Let's just say we're keen bird watchers for argument's sake. A few weeks back, the local fire service did some back burning in parts of the park. They did it over a couple of days, just burning off the leaf litter and dry stuff on the ground to prevent bigger fires later. They controlled it really well. Most of the trees and bigger plants survived, just a bit charred in places. Some grass even made it, while other patches were completely burnt, right down to the roots, leaving these round circles in the ground. The important thing is, the tree canopy was still intact. Anyway, about 48 hours after the back burning, my partner and I went for a walk in the park, along a track we've walked at least 200 times in the last 10 years. The first thing we noticed was how different it looked without all the little shrubs and ground cover. It was just this layer of ash, about 3,004 centimeters thick. It also smelled smoky, and it kind of irritated our throats. But the weirdest thing was how quiet it was. Usually you hear birds, snakes slithering away, lizards scurrying, ducks splashing in the creek that runs alongside the track. But it was dead silent. We kept going, even though we figured we wouldn't see much wildlife. We walked for about 20 minutes, just chatting, when suddenly we both whipped our heads to the left. These two vines, about 6 feet tall and 4 centimeters thick, came swinging towards us, like they'd been pulled back and released. We ran over to the trees, about 4 meters off the track, thinking maybe an animal had done it. My first instinct was to look up, thinking it might be a big bird taking off, but there were no birds, not a single one. And we would have heard it, the flapping wings breaking through the canopy. It wasn't any kind of goanna either. The only ones we have here are tree dwellers, and they'd head straight up a tree if startled. We checked every tree, every hollow log, any bit of ground cover that survived the fire. Nothing. It definitely wasn't a kangaroo or wallaby. We'd have seen it when we were checking the trees. And it wasn't a snake. The only big tree-climbing snake we have around here is the diamond python, and I can spot one of those a mile away. We kept walking for another 3 kilometers or so, and the whole time I felt like we were being watched. It was really unsettling. But that feeling completely vanished as soon as we turned around and started heading back. I don't think I've shared this part anywhere else. My partner and I went out another night, this time looking for nocturnal animals to photograph. We went to this waterfall, only about 15 minutes from our place. It's usually deserted at night, but packed on weekends during the day, especially in summer. The layout is basically a car park at the top of the falls, with a little park, BBQs, toilets, that kind of thing. From the car park you can get to the top of the falls, which is just a rock ledge with water running over it. There are also stairs that take you down to the middle and the bottom of the falls. It takes about 20 minutes to walk from top to bottom. So we parked the car, I grabbed my camera gear, and we started heading towards the top of the falls. Right as I went to lift my leg over the fence, I heard the most disturbing noise I've ever heard. It sounded like a human moaning in pain, but like 10 different people, all with different voices, moaning at the same time. I'm not easily spooked, but I'll admit, it sent chills down my spine. I told my partner to hurry up and get back to the car. We jumped in, locked the doors, and got out of there fast. Now, this place is pitch black at night. No lights, nothing. You wouldn't be there without a torch, and you'd definitely know if someone else was there by the cars in the car park. It's not a place you'd walk to. Later, I told a close mate of mine about it. He also goes to that waterfall to photograph wildlife. He told me he'd had a weird experience there too, the night before mine. He'd finished work late and thought he'd go for a quick walk to see what he could find. This was in spring, when everything is out and about because of the warm, humid weather. He said he'd parked his car and was halfway down the stairs to the bottom of the falls when he came across a snake. He was taking photos of it when he heard the toilet block door slamming. Over and over again. He started running back up the steps, and he said it sounded like something was inside the toilet block, just thrashing around, slamming things. He got in his car and left. So my mate and I decided to go back to the waterfall that night just to check it out. We parked the car and went straight to the toilet block. We checked the one he'd heard the noise in, and there was a fair bit of blood in the basin and a little pool of it in the soap dish. We thought about calling the cops, but what were we going to say? There's some blood in a toilet and we heard weird noises. We left soon after, and neither of us went back there for over a month. We've been back since, lots of times, and nothing weird has happened. This is the last one, taken from the forum where I first posted. So, the other night, we were driving along this road on the Central Coast. During the day, it's pretty busy because there are lots of houses and farms along it. But at night, it's usually dead quiet, just a few cars here and there. I have my high beams on most of the time. We'd been driving for about 40 minutes, looking for some nocturnal animals to photograph. This road goes through big stretches of bush on both sides, and it's not a straight or level road. It's got lots of turns and some pretty steep hills. Anyway, we weren't having any luck, so we decided to head back the way we came. We'd been driving for about 15 minutes when we came to one of those gradual inclines. About halfway up, I noticed something in the distance, maybe 250 meters away. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from my high beams, but then it moved from the middle of the road to the right side. While it was still moving, I asked my partner who'd been with me for all these weird experiences, "Can you see that?" And they said, "Yeah, what is that?" We got to the top of the hill where it leveled out and stopped where we'd seen it. I grabbed one of my torches and scanned the area. Turns out, where it had crossed to was a small property. A house with a little paddock and some horses. But the weird thing was, the horses weren't spooked at all. One of them was even close to the fence, just eating, and we're talking about a shape that moved across the road right in front of them. It just didn't make sense. If it was a person or a big animal, those horses would have reacted. They'd have been running around, snorting, something. But they were just chilling. So, yeah, that's my story. 4 weird, unexplained things that happened in the bush, all witnessed by at least 2 people. I still don't have a clue what any of it was. Like I said, I'm not saying it's aliens or ghosts or anything like that, but I've spent a lot of time in the bush, and I know what's normal and what's not. And this stuff, it definitely wasn't normal. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What else is out there that we just don't understand? It was late September 2008. Fire lookout duty usually meant boring days filled with nothing but watching the pretty countryside. Sometimes it involved doing important stuff that stopped wildfires from destroying homes and killing people. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I was stationed at a tower near Silvern, Colorado Thick. green forest with fancy mountain lodges hidden among the evergreen trees. Lately, things had felt off in the woods, weird enough that all of us lookouts were talking about it. It was something to break up the usual routine, at least. An older lookout named George liked to joke about the changes. He'd say things like, "These squirrels are hoarding nuts like there's no tomorrow. Maybe they know something we don't." But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was a bit of truth hidden under his humor. One Friday evening, George and I were having a few beers near my tower. He got all excited, telling me about the time he ran into a huge grizzly bear. He acted it out with big gestures, describing how he played dead, just like he'd read in some survival guide. He chuckled and said he'd never forget the bear's intense stare or its awful smell before it finally wandered off. We all figured bears were behind most of the weird stuff happening around our areas. I mean, run-ins happened from time to time, but they still freaked us out. The next week started like any other. I clocked in for my afternoon shift and got into my routine. But something felt different, like the air was thick with tension. That day, as I scanned the woods for any sign of danger, I saw what looked like fresh claw marks on a tall pine down by the water. I radioed the others, and right away, another lookout, Sarah Jenkins, said she'd seen similar marks in her area a few days ago. George chimed in, sounding serious for once, saying it had to be a bear and not to worry. But these weren't just any claw marks. The whole tree was almost hollowed out, like some giant woodpecker or some other unknown beast had gone to town on it. It was a freaky sight, but I pushed it aside and kept on with my work. About an hour after sunset, I heard a weird splashing sound, different from the usual calm sounds of the nearby stream. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it towards the noise, but there was nothing there. No elk or deer taking a drink, no surprised raccoons shaking water off their fur. As I started back to my tower, a scream ripped through the night, a raw, gut-wrenching sound that sliced through the silence. It chilled me to the bone, and the radio chatter that followed was just a blur in my ears. Something primal in me kicked in, and I felt like I had to find whoever or whatever made that horrifying howl. The woods felt different now, scary and unfamiliar. Shadows seemed to move in the darkness, and distant screeches echoed all around. When I finally got back to my tower, after what felt like forever, I tried to explain what happened over the radio, but I was so shaken up that my words came out all jumbled. My co-workers started sharing their own stories, like how Mary Johnson heard frantic crashing noises, and how Rick Miller noticed a strong, nasty smell around his tower. Each story was like another piece of a messed-up puzzle none of us wanted to solve. A collection of stories from fire lookouts now on alert and straining to put the pieces together. As the night went on and dread started to sink in, I saw something that shattered any attempt at rational explanation. A massive beast, all bulging muscles and thick, gnarled flesh, was stalking through the trees along the stream bank. My flashlight beam hid its twisted face, showing off needle-sharp teeth and empty, glassy eyes where a predator's calculating gaze should have been. I radioed for help, my voice trembling as I tried to describe the monstrous creature I'd just seen. My colleagues responded with panic and disbelief, not knowing what to do or how to react. The radio went silent, like we were all holding our breath. We agreed to meet up at a central location, figuring there was safety in numbers. As we gathered, Rick mentioned the strong smell had gotten worse around his tower, a stench so bad it was hard for him to breathe. Trying to come up with a plan, we wondered if this creature was some kind of cryptid known to roam the area. None of us had heard any stories like that before, but we couldn't rule it out. The sounds around us grew more sinister as the night wore on. Muffled crashes and sharp snapping noises mixed with blood-curdling screeches in the distance. We could sense the beast was getting closer. Sticking together, we cautiously made our way toward Mary's tower, hoping the high ground would give us some protection against this nightmarish creature. But our plan fell apart when we got to the base of her tower. The creature had already been there. Its claw marks were gouged deep into the wood. The sight was terrifying, filling us with a dread none of us wanted to voice. Suddenly, a bone-chilling scream pierced the darkness. It was Lisa, one of our fellow lookouts who hadn't made it to our meeting point. Panic took over, and we ran toward her last known location, our minds racing faster than our feet could carry us. We found her moments later, or what was left of her. The scene was horrific, churning our stomachs and sending shivers down our spines. Lisa's mangled body lay in a pool of blood, her limbs ripped from their sockets. Overwhelmed by shock and grief, we knew our only option was to get out of the forest as fast as possible. We called for emergency help on our radios, begging park rangers and local authorities to hurry, terrified of what this monstrous creature might do next. As we waited for help, we huddled together, petrified, desperate for any sign of rescue. The gut-wrenching screams continued on and off through the night as the creature hunted relentlessly. Our eyes widened when we saw red and blue lights on the horizon, the faint wail of sirens offering a glimmer of hope in the consuming darkness. We raced toward our salvation, our hearts pounding with exhaustion and sheer terror. When we finally reached the emergency vehicles at the edge of the forest, we collapsed into the arms of the officers, who tried to make sense of our terrified ramblings. They stared at us with disbelief and confusion before leading us away from that sinister place. In the days that followed, news reports flooded local stations. Search teams combed every inch of that cursed forest. Authorities found the remains of Lisa and other lookouts, who didn't make it through that nightmarish ordeal, but they found no trace of the massive creature that had haunted us. The presence of such an evil beast changed us forever, a wound that wouldn't heal, messing up our lives and careers in profound ways. We mourn those we lost that night: Lisa, Maria, Robertal colleagues who we used to share coffee with, chatting about our families or our latest hobbies. But now, bound by terror and seared into our memories, were only gruesome images so vivid they could never be erased. In this harrowing tale etched into our collective past, we were left wondering if it was better to survive or succumb to a monster amidst despairing darkness. I was sipping my water when my partner, Rex Sterling, walked up to me looking all confused. He handed me this thick, beat-up folder that came in the mail. Just the sight of it made me think of all the sleep I'd be losing. See, I'm Finnegan Finn O'Malley, a Green Beret, which you wouldn't think involves much paperwork. We were stationed at this isolated fort in Glacier National Park, Montana. This just came in today, Finn. Rex said, "Our new mission is to investigate something particularly disturbing." I opened the folder and started flipping through it. Now I understood why Rex looked so worried. It was full of unsolved cases, all involving really gruesome deaths around here. Each one was more messed up than the last. One group of campers got ripped apart, one by one. Then there was this guy they found hanging upside down from a tree, his guts pulled out and draped on the branches like some kind of sick Christmas decorations. Bear attacks? Rex whispered as we started into the dark woods. He was clearly freaked out. Maybe if they were on steroids, I joked, trying to lighten the mood, even though the air felt heavy. We were following a lead to some abandoned cabin deep in the park. The path was barely there, all overgrown and spooky. We finally got to this rundown cabin and went inside, super careful. Rex tripped over something in the mess of old furniture and junk. "I'm going to check out back," I whispered, and went out to look around. I stepped out into the scratchy bushes, and that's when I saw it. These huge claw marks dug into the ground. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Hey Rex, get out here," I called out. But before he could answer, this insane growl ripped through the air. We both froze, our eyes darting around, trying to find where it was coming from. Then we heard this sickening crack from the trees, like bone snapping, just 10 feet away. This massive thing lunged out of the darkness. It was huge, covered in matted fur, with these glowing green eyes and claws like daggers. It looked like some kind of twisted mix of a man and an animal. "Get to higher ground," Rex yelled. We scrambled up this old tree, our hearts pounding out of our chests. We were barely out of reach of this thing. "We gotta get our guns," I said, panicking. They were down on the ground where we had dropped them. "It can jump up here if it wants," Rex argued. "We have to distract it." Another growl, closer this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking like crazy. "There's a dangerous animal near our cabin," I shouted into the phone. "It attacked us. Please send help." They said they'd send someone, but it would take time. Rex found a big branch and chucked it away from the tree. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. "Now's our chance," Rex shouted and jumped down. I followed, running for our guns. The thing saw us and charged. Rex grabbed his gun and fired, but the bullets just seemed to piss it off. We ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and jammed a broken broom handle under the knob. "You think that'll hold?" I asked, gasping for air. "I hope so," Rex said, looking grim. Then bam, something crashed outside. One of our buddies, a camper named Clara, burst in, her face all torn up and bloody. "Clara," I yelled. She collapsed on the floor. We needed to help her. But we also had to deal with that thing outside. Come on, Rex said, pulling me away. We need a better weapon or a trap. We found some old hunting traps hanging on the wall. They were meant for big game, but would they work on this monster? It's a start, Rex said. We set the traps outside, and just in time, the creature slammed against the door again. It fell right into the first trap, howling in pain, but it just made it angrier. It kept coming, getting caught in more traps, roaring like crazy, until finally it limped back into the woods. We were shaking, terrified, but alive. When the authorities finally showed up, hours later, they took care of Clara and checked out our setup. You managed to fend off that thing? One officer asked, looking at us like we were crazy. What was that thing? I stammered. The officer took a deep breath. He told us about this thing from Scandinavian folklore, a werewolf called an Ellenvold. There haven't been many sightings reported over the years, he said, but your account closely matches what others have seen. A werewolf? Seriously? It sounded insane, but after what we'd just been through, I couldn't think of any other explanation. Clara was taken to the hospital. We stayed up all night, every little sound making us jump. Our lives eventually got back to some kind of normal, but we were changed. We'd faced something most people couldn't even imagine, and it left its mark on us. We survived an encounter with an Ellenvold, and we'd never forget it. It was a secret we carried, a terrifying memory that would always be there, lurking in the shadows. It was 2001, and things were about to get seriously weird in my quiet little corner of Alaska. My name's Jack, and I lived way off the grid in a cabin near Pay's Junction. Now, Alaska's got its share of strange stories, bear attacks, crazy weather, you name it. But I never paid them much mind. I was happy in my solitude, just me and the wilderness. One evening, I was cooking dinner over a fire pit when my neighbor, Ethan, showed up at the edge of my property. He looked worried, which was unusual. We weren't exactly best buddies, but we were friendly enough. "Jack," he said, "have you seen Ben, my son? He went into the woods this morning and hasn't come back." My stomach sank. Lost kids in the Alaskan wilderness? Never a good thing. "I haven't, Ethan," I said, "but we'll find him. Maybe he just got turned around." So, we spent the next few hours searching our properties, but no luck. It was strange, though. The whole forest was eerily silent. Even the animals seemed to have disappeared. As darkness fell, we were starting to get really worried. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like we were searching for a needle in a haystack. And then it happened. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. "Ben!" Ethan yelled. We took off running towards the sound. It seemed to be coming from behind Ethan's house, in an area with thick trees and rocky terrain. We hadn't brought any radios, no signal out there anyway, and I started to regret not calling for help before we left. After what felt like forever, pushing through bushes and branches, we finally found Ben. He was slumped against a tree, his clothes torn, covered in scratches. but thank God he was alive. "Ben, are you okay?" Ethan rushed to his side. It attacked me," Ben stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "It had roots for arms, sharper than any knife." He trailed off, unable to say more. I peered into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. We knew we had to get out of there, and fast. As we helped Ben to his feet, Ethan noticed something that made his blood run cold. Deep gashes were carved into the trees around us. Whatever had attacked Ben was no ordinary animal. We made our way back home, sticking close together, every snapping twig and rustling leaf making us jump. Ben kept muttering about the creature, but he couldn't seem to bring himself to describe it. Back at Ethan's place, he thanked me profusely and rushed Ben inside, double-checking all the locks. I went back to my cabin and did the same. I couldn't shake off Ben's words, roots for arms. It was a chilling image. The next day, I went straight to the local authorities and reported everything. Ethan and Ben were there too, pale and shaken. The officer took our statements and said there had been other strange incidents reported in the area. I suggested we form a search party, but Ethan and Ben were adamant. They wanted nothing more to do with whatever was out there. The officer agreed, saying it was probably safer to stay away. I couldn't just let it go, though. I went to the library and started digging into local history and folklore. I figured there had to be some explanation, and that's when I found it. Old newspaper clippings, whispered legends. They all pointed to a creature called a gritslang, a creature with roots for arms and a venomous gaze. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window, watching the shadows, listening to the sounds of the forest, and then I saw it, the gritslang, standing right outside my fence. Its eyes locked onto mine, filled with malice. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, cowering beneath the window, praying it wouldn't see me. Thankfully, it disappeared back into the darkness before the operator answered. 3 days later, I was packing up my things, ready to get the hell out of Pays Junction. A local historian stopped by and told me he'd heard about our encounter. He confirmed that it was indeed a gritslang, and that according to legend, it lured people into its lair deep in the woods. As I drove away, I saw the scars on the trees, a chilling reminder of the gritslang. It was a terrifying experience, one that I'll never forget. I learned that even in the most ordinary seeming places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. Sweat was dripping down my face as I cranked out pull-ups in the middle of my daily workout. Suddenly, Lieutenant Commander Rickards, our CO, burst into the gym, yelling, "Red alert, boys. We've got an urgent mission." I dropped from the bar and sprinted towards him, my fellow SEALs right behind me. Turns out, we were being sent to investigate a string of bizarre murders in a creepy old mining town called Al Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachians. The victims were being brutally mauled, and the local cops were stumped. Whatever was doing this wasn't like any animal they'd ever seen. "Not gonna lie, this one's giving me the creeps," Mark Jensen muttered as we boarded the chopper. I had to agree, but I couldn't resist giving him a hard time. Well, at least we know you won't make a good rug for that thing, huh? When we got to Owl Hollow, the first thing that hit us was the silence. It was eerie. The sky was overcast, and everything felt damp, even though it wasn't raining. We walked through narrow streets lined with old weather-beaten houses, and you could tell the locals were terrified. Nobody wanted to come out of their homes. We set up our base in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, unloaded our gear, and tried to prepare for whatever we were about to face. I introduced myself to Mayor Bennington, who gave us copies of the victim reports and any other info he could scrape together. We studied the photos of the bodies, slashed throats, limbs torn apart, the whole 9 yards. It was gruesome, but it didn't give us any real clues about what we were dealing with. Mayor Bennington's voice shook as he told us about an old legend. Apparently, folks around there believed some kind of creature roamed the mountains. He said it all started over a century ago, when some miners stumbled onto something they shouldn't have. Of course, y'all understand I don't believe any of that. He added, his eyes darting around nervously, "We're all adults here." Yeah, right. Our first day of investigation took us to a dense forest where one of the recent murders had happened. As we moved through the trees, we noticed a pungent smell like rotten eggs mixed with burnt hair. David, our tracker, pointed out the disturbed soil and blood. Whatever killed these people was definitely not your average bear. As the sun started to set, we stumbled on the entrance to a huge tunnel system built into the hillside. Suddenly, we heard screams echoing from deep inside. My heart started pounding, and I could see the fear in my teammates' eyes, even though we were all trying to stay focused. "Huddle up," Lieutenant Commander Rickards ordered. We formed a tight circle while he laid out a plan. We don't know what's down there or who needs help. We need to proceed with extreme caution. Weapons drawn, we entered the darkness. With every step, I thought my own pulse was going to echo through those tunnels. Then, as we ventured deeper, this grotesque creature suddenly appeared from the shadows. It must have been at least 10 feet tall, with razor-sharp spikes running down its back and a head full of teeth. Its eyes were pale and piercing, like searchlights in the dark. "We need to get the hell out of here," I yelled, and we all turned and sprinted back the way we came. The creature snarled and roared behind us, its powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. We knew calling for backup was pointless. Nobody could get to us in time. David led the way while Sarah frantically gasped into the radio, trying to tell the operator about our situation. Their response wasn't exactly comforting. They couldn't reach us in time. We were exhausted, but we couldn't stop running, not even for a second. Then, Lieutenant Commander Rickards tripped and fell. Mike and I yanked him back to his feet as he yelped in pain. We didn't dare look back to see how close the creature was. Just when all hope seemed lost, David shouted, "There's the exit." We pushed ourselves harder than ever, the light from the entrance growing closer. Bursting out into the open air, we knew we couldn't stop to catch our breath. We had to keep moving. We ran through the forest, adrenaline pumping. We could hear the creature crashing through the trees behind us. Its roars were getting closer. The thick foliage made it hard to see, but we knew it was still hunting us. Just when despair started to set in, we heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over us. Someone had finally heard our call. We raced towards the sound, waving our arms, hoping they would spot us. An assault team arrived at the edge of the forest. As we stumbled towards them, gunfire erupted behind us. We turned to see the creature writhing on the ground, riddled with bullets. The firing stopped, and the monster lay lifeless, a gruesome heap instead of the terrifying predator that had chased us. The main squad led us away from the fallen creature. Looking back at its lifeless eyes, we felt a wave of sadness. We were lucky to escape, but others weren't so fortunate. Later, we learned that our story was just one of many disturbing tales from those mountains. The authorities decided to keep the details under wraps to avoid a panic, but we knew what awaited anyone who dared to venture into those tunnels. Every now and then, I find myself thinking about that night and mourning those who weren't as lucky as we were. I'll revise the story to enhance the language, formatting, and flow, making it more engaging and readable. I'll also incorporate colloquialisms to give it a natural conversational feel, and use the character names you've provided. Here's the improved version. The crime scene was a bloodbath. I'd never seen anything like it in my years as a small-town cop. I'm Jack Edwards, by the way, and gruesome cases were about as rare in our sleepy community as a blizzard in July. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I sucked in a lungful of air, trying to quell the nausea churning in my gut. The victim's body was sprawled across the office floor, twisted into an unnatural position. This wasn't just another murder. It was something far more sinister. "You okay there, Jack?" My partner, Sarah Miller, eyed me with concern, her gaze flickering across the gruesome scene. "Never better," I rasped, sarcasm lacing my words. "This mess makes me want to swear off meat forever." Sarah chuckled and gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Not every day we stumble upon something like this in Havenwood. Good thing we skipped breakfast, huh?" The office belonged to Mark Johnson, a real estate agent known for closing deals faster than a cheetah on Red Bull. It was smack dab in the middle of Main Street, in Havenwood, your typical small-town America, with its cozy cafes, quaint antique shops, and friendly locals. As Sarah and I meticulously combed through the crime scene, documenting every shred of evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. The brutality of the murder was unlike anything I'd encountered in my 2 decades on the force. We interviewed Mark's coworkers and learned that he'd closed up shop for a few days because of some weirdo who'd been lurking around his office. A menacing character with unkempt hair, he'd been a fixture outside Mark's office for over a week. Descriptions varied. Some mentioned concealed weapons, but no one knew who he was or why he was there. It was like he'd materialized out of thin air. A week later, just as we were starting to hit dead ends, we got a frantic call from the local bakery. Another murder. This time it was Emily Carter, the owner. Her body bore a chilling resemblance to the real estate agent's. Both were mutilated beyond recognition, with deep claw-like marks gouged into their flesh. A sickening realization dawned on us. We might be dealing with a serial killer. The story spread like wildfire, with newspapers and TV stations across the state dubbing our mystery menace the Havenwood Ripper. We interviewed friends, family, employees, but no one could link Mark and Emily. Our relentless pursuit of evidence was turning up nothing, and our spirits were starting to flag. The next few weeks were a blur of horror. A string of brutal murders plagued Havenwood, and we were no closer to unmasking our sadistic killer. Sarah and I worked day and night, trying to connect the dots, but it was like chasing shadows. Then, one sweltering afternoon in mid-August, an anonymous tip led me to a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with humidity, and storm clouds gathered overhead, threatening to unleash a downpour. The dilapidated structure stood amidst a field of overgrown weeds, like a stubborn memory refusing to fade. It was the perfect hideout for something sinister. As I stepped into the gloom, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The warehouse was a graveyard of rusted machinery and decaying crates. The silence was broken only by the echo of my own footsteps, a faint reminder that there was still air to breathe within those oppressive walls. "Jack, you there?" Sarah's voice crackled through my radio. "Yeah," I whispered, not wanting to disturb whatever evil might be lurking in the shadows. "Just entered the warehouse. I'll let you know if I find anything." "Be careful, Jack," she replied, her voice tight with concern. My flashlight beam swept across the floor, and something caught my eye. A backpack lay discarded against a wall, its contents spilled out. Newspaper clippings and photographs of Mark, Emily, and the other victims. My pulse quickened. I had to call for backup. "Sarah, I found something. Get here ASAP," I said into the radio. "On my way, Jack," she replied, her voice edged with anticipation. I continued my exploration while waiting for Sarah to arrive. My flashlight illuminated a makeshift living area, with filthy blankets strewn across a corner. Someone had been living here, amongst the decay and shadows. As I moved closer to inspect the bedding, a shiver ran down my spine. I was being watched. Before I could react, a figure lunged at me from behind a stack of crates. He was massive, his body scarred and menacing. He tackled me to the ground, pinning me beneath his weight. Panic surged through me as he clawed at my chest. I couldn't break free, couldn't even scream for help. His grip was suffocating. Suddenly, Sarah burst through the warehouse doors, gun drawn. She fired a shot, the bullet grazing the attacker's head. He loosened his grip momentarily, and I seized the opportunity, shoving him off and scrambling away. He rose to attack again, but Sarah fired another shot, this one hitting him squarely in the chest. He stumbled backward, collapsing against a crate, motionless. I gasped for breath, thanking Sarah for her quick action. Paramedics and backup arrived soon after, tending to my injuries and securing the scene. We identified the man as David Miller, a former employee of both Mark and Emily. A search of his belongings revealed he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and had developed a deadly obsession with his former employers after being fired months prior. In the days that followed, we learned that David had been stalking his victims before unleashing his fury, leaving those horrific claw marks as his signature. He became known as the Havenwood Ripper, the man who terrorized our peaceful town. We held a memorial service for the victims, their loved ones, and community members vowing to never forget them. With David behind bars, Havenwood could finally begin to heal. As for Sarah and me, we continued to serve and protect, forever vigilant, knowing that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. The scars left by the Havenwood Ripper served as a constant reminder of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of small-town America. If you had told me 2 days ago that I'd be running for my life in the dead of night, I would have laughed and probably offered you a beer to calm your nerves. My name is Jack Reynolds, and what happened to me on that fateful day is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It was 2019, smack in the middle of nowhere, actually. A remote cabin in the woods of West Virginia. I'd gone there for some peace and quiet, a break from my usual grind of fixing bikes and tuning engines. I suppose I should start by saying I'm no stranger to hardship. Growing up with a dad who was more into his whiskey than his family, I learned to fend for myself early on. Got pretty good with my hands, which is why I ended up as a mechanic. Life isn't always kind, but it teaches you to be tough, resilient. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to face. The day started off normal enough. I woke up early, around 6 a.m., to the sounds of birds chirping and the soft rustle of leaves. It was tranquil, the kind of serenity you rarely find in the city. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch to take it all in. The cabin belonged to my buddy Mark, who let me use it whenever I needed to get away. Mark and I go way back to high school, and he's one of the few people I trust implicitly. Around mid-morning, I decided to take a hike. There was an old trail Mark had mentioned, one that led to a beautiful clearing by a small lake. Seemed like a good way to spend the day. So, I grabbed my backpack, filled it with some essentials, water, a couple of sandwiches, and a flashlight, and set off. I wasn't armed. Didn't think I'd need a gun out here. Besides, the place was supposed to be safe, or so I thought. The hike was refreshing, the air was crisp, the scenery picturesque. But as I walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping up on me. It was subtle at first, like the feeling you get when you realize you've forgotten something important but can't quite put your finger on what it is. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the isolation. I reached the lake around noon. It was everything Mark had described, clear blue water surrounded by tall pines. A perfect spot to relax. I found a nice spot to sit, pulled out one of my sandwiches, and began to eat. The silence was almost therapeutic, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish jumping or a bird calling. After lunch, I decided to take a nap under the shade of a large oak tree. That's when things started to get strange. I must have dozed off for about an hour when I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, my senses on high alert. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the trees and the lake, same as before. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. Maybe it was just a deer or some other woodland creature, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. The trail seemed longer on the way back, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves making me jump. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I made it back to the cabin by late afternoon, the sun starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. I locked the door behind me, feeling a strange sense of relief to be indoors. I tried to shake off the unease by busying myself with mundane tasks, cleaning up, preparing dinner, anything to distract my mind. It worked for a while, but as the evening wore on, the feeling returned, stronger than ever. I decided to call Mark, just to have someone to talk to. Maybe he could give me some reassurance. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Hey Jack, how's the cabin treating you?" Mark's voice was cheerful, a stark contrast to the anxiety gnawing at my insides. "Hey Mark, everything's fine, I guess. Just something feels off, you know." "Off? What do you mean?" I tried to explain the feeling, the strange noises, the sense of being watched. Mark listened patiently, then chuckled. "Sounds like you've been alone too long, buddy. Probably just your mind playing tricks on you." "Yeah, maybe," I replied, not entirely convinced. "Look, if it'll make you feel better, I can come up tomorrow. We'll have a few beers, do some fishing. How's that sound?" "Sounds good, man. Thanks." We hung up, and I felt a little better. Mark was probably right. It was all in my head. I made myself some dinner, watched a bit of TV, and eventually went to bed. That's when things took a turn for the worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something banging on the side of the cabin. It was loud, forceful, like someone or something was trying to get in. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window. The banging continued, each thud sending a jolt of fear through me. I peered through the window but saw nothing. The banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, flashlight in hand, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was close, too close. My mind raced. What the hell was it? I decided to check the door. As I approached, I noticed the doorknob slowly turning. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was like something out of a nightmare. The knob turned, then stopped. I held my breath, praying it would go away. The silence stretched on, and finally the knob released. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed a weapon, something to defend myself. I cursed myself for not bringing a gun. The best I could find was a hefty fireplace poker. Not exactly ideal, but it would have to do. I spent the rest of the night on edge, every creak, every whisper of wind setting me on high alert. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I felt a surge of relief. I decided to head into town, maybe get some supplies, and definitely get a gun. But first, I needed to check around the cabin. What I found sent chills down my spine. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, as if something large had been moving through the area. I found deep gouges in the wood of the cabin's exterior, as if claws had raked across it. There were footprints too, but not human. They were large, almost bear-like, but different. I didn't know what to make of it. I packed up some things and drove into town. The locals were friendly enough, but when I mentioned what had happened, they grew quiet, exchanging uneasy glances. One old-timer, a guy named Earl, pulled me aside. "You say you heard something strange?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, something was trying to get into the cabin last night. Left some pretty nasty marks, too." Earl nodded, his face serious. "You're not the first to experience something like that around here. Folks say it's a creature, something that's been around these parts for ages. Some say it's Bigfoot, others think it's something else, something worse." I laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Bigfoot? You're kidding, right?" Earl didn't laugh. "You can believe what you want, but something's out there. Best be careful." I thanked him and headed to the local hardware store. I bought a shotgun and some shells, feeling a bit more secure. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I decided to stay one more night, just to see if whatever it was would return. I wasn't going to let some legend scare me off. As night fell, I made sure the cabin was secure. I loaded the shotgun and kept it close. The hours dragged on, the silence oppressive. I was on edge, every sound amplified in the stillness. Then, just past midnight, it started again. The banging, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed the shotgun and flashlight, heart pounding. I moved to the door, trying to peer through the window without being seen. The doorknob started to turn again, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I threw the door open, flashlight and shotgun at the ready. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was massive, covered in matted fur, with long, powerful limbs. It stood on two legs, but its posture was hunched, almost ape-like. Its eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, but I couldn't make out any details. I aimed the shotgun, hands shaking, and fired. The creature let out a terrible noise, part roar, part scream, and retreated into the darkness. I fired again, but it was gone, vanished into the night. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, breathing hard. What the hell was that thing? The rest of the night was tense but quiet. Morning brought a sense of relief, but also a resolve. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things, double-checked the shotgun, and headed out. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the creature was out there, lurking. I made it back to town and decided to head straight home. I called Mark, told him what had happened. He listened, then laughed nervously. "You sure you didn't just imagine it, Jack?" "Trust me, Mark, I wish I had." I got back home, trying to put the experience behind me. But it's hard to forget something like that. I did some research, looking into local legends, trying to make sense of it all. The stories varied, but they all pointed to one thing. Something was out there, something that defied explanation. Months passed and life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. I stayed busy with work, kept my mind occupied, but every now and then I'd think back to that night, to the creature. I never went back to the cabin, and Mark didn't push it. He probably thought I'd lost my mind, but I knew what I'd seen. A few weeks ago I got a call from Earl. He'd heard about another sighting, similar to mine. A hiker had gone missing, and the search party found signs of a struggle, strange footprints. It sent a chill through me. Whatever it was still out there. I'm not sure why I'm telling you all this. Maybe it's to warn you, maybe it's just to get it off my chest. But if you ever find yourself in the woods of West Virginia, be careful.